So hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Dave Chancellor, and I'll be your host today. So we are going to be talking about how the U.S. working poor and working class have been doing since the Great Recession. And our webinar is actually based on work from a new volume of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. And we've got a great group of scholars who have contributed to that volume, who will talk about some of what we've seen in the long and often slow recovery from the Great Recession through the pandemic, and a bit about what may be coming next. Our panel today includes Erica Groshen, who will be our moderator and discussant, Timothy Smeeding, who is one of the volume editors, and we'll talk about the volume and how some of the major questions that came up as they were putting that together can frame our discussion here in this webinar today. We're going to hear from Jasmine Simington, who is going to help us think about how these issues from kind of a perspective of place and community, especially when it comes to people who have high levels of deprivation. Jeff Smith, who's going to join us in just a moment, and he'll be talking about entry into the workforce and how programs like career and technical education might be able to help. And finally, Fenaba Addo and William Darity Jr., who will talk to us about how these trends have varied by race, especially when it comes to issues of mobility and wealth accumulation. So I'm so thankful that you could all be here to join us today. Our webinar series is partially supported through funding from the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation from the Department of Health and Human Services. That said, any positions expressed in today's webinar aren't necessarily those of ASPE or the Institute for Research on Poverty. Today, to start us off, we have the honor of having Dr. Erica Groshen serve as our moderator and our discussant. And Dr. Groshen, you're a senior economics advisor at the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations and a research fellow at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. From 2013 to 2017, you served as the commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and were with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York before that. So you're going to start us off by kind of framing this issue, and later on, you'll also be leading us in discussion to kind of wrap up what we've heard. So Dr. Groshen, I'm going to turn it to you now. Thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome, Dave, and please call me Erica. Okay. So good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here to continue the discussion that this really interesting volume got started. And what I want to do is just tell the audience a little bit about the paper that Harry Holzer, who's a professor at Georgetown University, the McCourt School of Public Policy, and I wrote for the volume. It's the first paper in the volume, and Tim asked us, Tim was one of the editors, the organizers of the volume. Tim asked us to describe 40 years of trends in wages and labor force participation for the working class, that is, workers with a high school education or less, compared to workers with a college degree or more. So that was our task. Look at these 40 years and paint with a very broad brush what has happened to the working class. So to do that, we compared cyclical peaks over the entire period from 1979 to 2019, with a particular focus on the Great Recession, which began in 2007, and the recovery after that, 2010 through 2019. And then we also commented, obviously, on the COVID recession, as all of us have. Okay, so what we found are three very disappointing trends in the labor market over the past 40 years. These trends really stand out. First of all, real, that is, inflation-adjusted median wages have been fairly stagnant. So the median is where about half of the about half of the workers, where the wage of kind of the exact middle of the distribution is, and those have been stagnant. Right? No increase in inflation-adjusted wages in 40 years. Right? We also found, that not surprising, that inequality between workers who have a college degree and those without college degrees has increased dramatically. So we have a stagnant middle and a vastly increasing upper tail. And the third thing that we found that was very disappointing is that many less educated prime age males have left the workforce. So remember, we're comparing business cycle peaks on this. So we're taking out the effect of the business cycle directly. At the same time, gender inequality in both earnings and labor force activity has declined. So that's a salutary impact. But gaps between whites and blacks grew, while Hispanics and Asians have made progress, more progress than blacks. And then we also find that the early effects of the 2021 pandemic recession has hurt less educated workers and those of color more than anyone else. So that's the framing for the next three papers that you're going to hear about. And there are many more papers in the conference, but this is a really excellent distillation of some of the findings that others talk more about in the rest of the conference. And so Professor Timothy Smeeding, he's the Lee Rainwater Distinguished Professor of Public Affairs and Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, my alma mater. He's a former director of the Institute for Research on Poverty. He's a founder of the Luxembourg Income Study, and he's one of the editors of the volume that we're talking about in today's webinar. And Tim, I apologize for speeding ahead on that. Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen here. I assume everyone can see what's going on now. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to talk about our volume. Once I get this thing to advance, and it's up there. There we go. It's starting to advance. Here we go. This is the ANNALS volume that we've produced. It's open access until November 15th. Jenny Romick, one of the co-editors, has already put some link to that. There's another link here, and this will be available after. The table of contents, all 19 chapters, you can click on that and all the rest of it. So I want to thank Tom Kexsmethy, the ANNALS executive editor, and Sage Publishing for making this available to everybody. And I also want to thank my wonderful co-editors, Jenny Romick and Mike Strain. We couldn't have done this unless we did it together. So welcome to the project. October 19, big question. What happened to the American working class since the Great Recession? Okay. Seems like a great thing to do. Is there room for upward mobility? Is the American dream dead? One of my co-editors, Mike Strain, had written this. And we had a working group from IRP. And we decided, let's go see if we can figure the answer out. So, you know, we're in the middle of the longest post-war recovery from July to October 2019 and counting, more than 10 years of expansion and recovery. There's no end in sight. Let's go. Tom gave us some money. We got support. We lined up a great list of authors and papers, and then bang, COVID happened. We had to postpone some meetings. We had an election in there. And our project kind of took on new meaning. So now what we ended up to say is we ended up with an end to the long recovery. And so now the long recovery is sandwiched between the Great Recession and the COVID recession and recovery. So here's the three key periods that I'm going to focus on. The Great Recession, short but deep compared to what we had seen before. A long recovery. Then the COVID-19 recession and recovery. And that's essentially what we're trying to do in the book. We began just trying to capture the long recovery and the effects of low unemployment, not knowing when it would end, but boom, we ended up with a challenge to examine it. It's framed in by two recessions, the Great Recession and then the COVID recession, and now the COVID recovery. So how did you see this in one picture? This is the Erica Groshen picture. Erica started manufacturing these babies a long time ago. And here we were. And what you can see here is the small lines are all the previous measured recessions. The orange line is the Great Recession, which went on for, for a period, and then the long recovery. And the recovery goes back only to, on this graph, to where it touches the previous employment high. But it went on for another 69 months. And with about a 10% increase in the total number of workers. So this long recovery lasted for a record 127 months. Okay? Then immediately it was followed by the COVID bang, the end, and now the bounce back. And just to show you that this diagram is more than famous by us, here's the Washington Post version from about a month ago, the same diagram. And you can see that we've added a few more months of recovery. It's picking up steam, okay? And this led to a lot of wonderful Labor Day articles and pronouncements that there's a big labor shortage out there. And finally, the working class may be getting ahead. But we have some things, some perspectives to offer on that. And that's where we're going to go next, okay? 3 broad questions structure the volume and structure the questions we're asking today. How have poor and working class Americans and those at risk of economic disadvantage fared during the expansion? How has the labor market changed since the Great Recession? And how have labor market institutions and social policy systems serving lower income working class Americans changed over or reacted to the expansion? Those are the broad questions. Okay. We had 19 papers, a lot of papers. We might have had 20, but one dropped out, but only one. We started with 3 broad overviews, a macro chapter, the labor market chapter that Erica and Harry mentioned, and an income and material well-being chapter by Jim Ziliak. Then we had a slew of papers on population outcomes for workers by education levels, those with criminal system involvement, the disabled, that was headed by Mary Daly. I was the head of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank and was an expert in disability. We had one on Native Americans, on Black workers, and Black-white wealth groups. That will be the paper you'll hear from Sandy and Fenaba soon, on Latinx and immigrants. We also focused on institutions, employer practices and worker protections, labor market institutions, income support systems, and workforce training and CTE, and that's Jeff, and he's coming on. We looked at pockets of success and distress too. So we looked at opioids. Janet Curry did that paper, and very surprising but interesting findings. And then on communities advancing and not so much, and that's where Jasmine did her work with Luke Schaefer and others. And finally, we ended with 2 contrasting reaction papers, one by Rich Burkhauser and Doug Holtz-Eakin, and one by Gary Burtless and Bell Sawhill. They saw the same data, they saw the same conference, and they come to completely opposite policy prescriptions. So we have all of that interest in here. Next, what did we learn? 5 quick take-home messages. Tight labor markets with long periods of low unemployment and steady growth clearly benefit the earnings and incomes of the working class. I like the boats metaphor, and the rising tide did indeed eventually lift all economic boats by 2018 and 19. The upper end, the yachts did fine all along. The tugboats, that's the working class, and the rowboats, that's the poor, made absolute gains. But wages did not rise to very high levels in many low-skilled rowboat and working class tugboat occupations. So we noted that. I mean, you can talk about all the percentage increases you want, but when the bases look like this, you're not going to do so well. So this is employment and median hourly wages in May 2019, well into the recovery. And you can see there's a whole bunch of occupations where people are still making $14 an hour and less, okay? And these are huge occupations, and they're mainly low-skilled people and blue-collar people who don't have college educations. So we made some progress, but not as much as you might have thought. The second, the timing of recovery varies substantially by group. The most cyclical workers and boom-bust boom economies are those in the lowest paid, lowest skilled jobs, working class. Some groups, such as low educated minorities and disabled, only really benefited in the last few years of the expansion. And another really important theme that came through, tight labor markets and the long recovery meant gains in absolute level of earnings and incomes for most everybody. But signs of relative progress for groups at the bottom were harder to come by. For example, racial income and wealth gaps did not really close over the long recession. You'll hear more about that. Pockets of success were found, but not everywhere and not always. And again, there are differences between the absolute gains and relative gains in almost every metric we looked at. Pockets of distress and enemy are still with us. The opioid epidemic is not over and seems to have expanded during COVID, expanded during an expanding labor market. Young adults with involvement in the criminal justice system were last hired in the long recovery as well. And finally, institutional rigidities are important. We did a really good job on, I think, on these, looking at non-compete clauses and regulations and so forth. And they have a crucial role in determining workers' outcomes, and they change only slowly during the long recovery. So that's sort of the message. Now, what's been happening since that message? We couldn't stop right there. What we discovered as we put the volume out it's listed as May, it appeared in August this year. The relative status of income support programs suggested that, institutional features of the safety net were pretty well fixed and non-expensive before the COVID recession. But the policy response was strong to the recession, buoyed families in 2020 with expanded unemployment benefits and EIP's emergency income payments, and help businesses hold on to workers and so forth. So that was a good push. Then we had an election and we had an even bigger push. The American Rescue Plan expanded emergency coverage and support for middle and lower income families, leading to a 9% increase in net income for the second income quintile in 2021. That's the Tax Policy Center. And that's where many of the working class are located. The AARP strengthened food programs, expanded the child tax credit and child care subsidies, in addition to expanding healthcare programs. So that sort of takes us to where we are today in terms of policy, but what's next for the working class? Well, guys, it's a whole new labor market and we're all trying to figure it out, okay? The labor scarcity we're experiencing is real, but as David Otter, and I'm quoting him here, said on Labor Day, this is an opportunity, not a crisis. There's labor shortages and quit rates are leading to big changes in wages, working conditions, and perhaps even institutional changes in labor markets, improving the quality of jobs and career paths. This is good. Now, we still have some recovering to do from COVID and in the labor market, but declining birth rates, fast retiring baby boomers faster than scheduled, and severe immigration restrictions all mean that the supply of labor is going to be somewhat constrained nationwide and probably in most places for a number of years. So here we are, folks, in the resignation economy with high quit rates, which suggest a better future for the working class beyond what we found at the end of the long recovery. The next volume somebody may do will have to do with what happened in the current recovery that we're in and how it compares. But we did ours based on the longest recovery extant in the country. So today, these are the three papers. I don't have to, they're all being introduced. We're going to hear about communities, workforce entry and CTE, and wealth race in the working class, okay? And the next ANNALS volume, I must say, webinar is going to focus on federal fiscal policy. It's called The Long Recovery from the Great Recession, Public Policy in the Working Class. If you click there, you can register. It's AEI. Mike Strain's the host editor. Ryan Nunn will be on there. Jeff will appear again. CTE is popular. And there'll be a knockdown, drag-out fight between Doug Holtzik and Abel Sawhill over what we should be doing next. That ought to be exciting. Okay. And we just want to thank our sponsors. I won't list them all. Our authors who really hung with us, changing jobs, institutions, and obviously dealing with family responsibilities that changed just like all of us. And the key staff who really made it all happen. So that's it for me. I'm done. And I want to turn it over back to Erica, and she can introduce our next speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm back, and now I'm going to be in the right order. Thank you, Tim. So now we're going to hear 3 papers. The first one is by Jasmine Simington. And I've told you already, she's a joint doctoral student at University of Michigan, focusing on spatial inequality and housing policy. And she's also an SF Fellow, Ford Foundation Predoctoral Fellow, and Student Researcher at Poverty Solutions. I'm glad I got to list those again, Jasmine. There's a lot to be proud of there. So Jasmine is going to talk to us about her work on geographic pockets of success and distress. So Jasmine, take it away.
Thanks so much, Erica. I'm just going to get my slides going for us. Thanks so much to the team at the Institute for Research on Poverty for the opportunity to share this work. As they mentioned, the paper I'll be presenting is entitled Communities Moving Ahead, Falling Behind, Evidence from the Index of Deep Disadvantage, which I had the pleasure of writing alongside Vincent Fusaro of Boston College, Luke Schaefer at the University of Michigan. So a quick overview of the paper. In examining the impacts and recovery of the Great Recession, it's important to understand whether people and places were affected the same or differently. Our paper focuses on community-level economic well-being to examine the trajectories of communities prior to the Great Recession and long into the recovery. We explore geographic, demographic, and economic factors associated with these different trajectories for communities, as well as the nature of change across the different trajectories. Households were unequally exposed to the hardships of the Great Recession. Black and Hispanic people were more likely than white households to suffer from unemployment, and the poverty rate for these groups also increased more than the rate for white households. Furthermore, people with lower levels of education, income, and wealth saw disproportionately greater economic instability. In addition to the effects on people, the consequences of the recession varied geographically. Some states experienced significant declines in employment and increases in poverty, but others only saw moderate changes. Researchers have found that unemployment rates varied across states, with counties in the West, Southeast, and Midwest exhibiting surges in unemployment more so than other regions. Areas with larger non-white populations, lower levels of education, and strong manufacturing and construction industries also suffered from higher unemployment rates. Likewise, research looking at smaller geographies showed that neighborhoods with pre-existing disadvantage and more people of color were more likely to see declines in their local labor and housing markets. Previous studies on geographic variation in recession recovery have been restricted to single places or single indicators, and they often end relatively early within the full recovery period. Our paper advances the limitations of this prior research by exploring how communities change across multiple indicators and into this full stages of recovery. We also explore whether there are differences between the communities that improved, grew worse, or remained relatively stable. And lastly, we examine the trajectories of communities where the working class reside in particular. The first objective of this study was to classify community disadvantage, and then we will examine how it changes pre and post recession. We operationalize community at the county level, recognizing that there is important within county heterogeneity, and we measure community disadvantage using the multi-dimensional index of disadvantage, the IDD. The IDD was constructed by an interdisciplinary team of researchers from the University of Michigan and Princeton from the Understanding Communities of Deep Disadvantage project funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The IDD combines census and administrative data to examine socioeconomic vulnerability across 3 domains: income, health, and social mobility. These variables are weighted using principal component analysis, and the IDD is the first principal component, accounting for over 60% of the variation in the data. In this paper, we extend initial analyses to construct new versions of the IDD for pre and post recession. Poverty data comes from the small area income and poverty estimates, Low birth weight data comes from the National Center for Health Statistics, and life expectancy data comes from the Robert Wood Johnson County Health Rankings. Estimates for social mobility come from Opportunity Insights. And our pre-recession analyses cover the period of 2003 to 2006, and post-recession covers 2012 to 2019. We start our analysis by dividing all counties into vintiles, 20 equal-sized groups, based on their pre-recession IDD, and we repeat this procedure for the post-recession IDD. We classify counties as advantaged if they are above the median value of the IDD pre-recession, and disadvantaged if they are below the median pre-recession IDD. Amongst disadvantaged counties, 16% were considered decliners and 17% were risers. Declining counties are counties that moved the adjacent vintile down the ranking. Rising counties are counties that moved the adjacent vintile up the ranking. Stable counties did not change vintiles or they moved into the adjacent vintile. The overwhelming majority of counties, 67%, were stable in rank. Stable counties had the lowest mean IDD score, meaning that the worst off counties were the least likely to change in ranking on average. Risers, by contrast, had the lowest mean unemployment rate, highest median annual income, and a larger share of their working class, of their working age population had a bachelor's degree. This map shows the geographic distribution of county trajectories. The largest group of counties, the advantaged ones, are those in purple, and they are found predominantly in the Northeast, Midwest, and West. Disadvantaged counties are further categorized into stable, rising, or declining. Stable counties, those in green, are concentrated in the South with clusters in Montana and the Dakotas, Southwest, and Upper Midwest. Declining counties, colored in red, are found in the Rust Belt and clusters in the South, and there are clusters in the South and the Southwest, while you see that the rising counties in blue appear throughout Texas and are scattered across the West and the South. We also explored absolute change over time for disadvantaged counties. We found that poverty and low birth weights were slightly higher post-recession, and life expectancy increased. Unemployment declined, and median income increased on average. Differences in change over time were statistically significant on nearly all time varying factors, except for unemployment. The direction of change, however, differed across trajectory groups. Declining and stable counties saw an increase in their poverty rate, while risers saw a decrease. Rising counties also saw life expectancy jump a full year, while declining and stable counties saw much smaller changes. This paper shows that most communities experienced relative stability when comparing pre and post-recession well-being. Disadvantaged counties were likely to remain so, as were advantaged counties. About one third of counties did shift, however, 1/3 of disadvantaged counties, with 16% categorized as declining and 17% considered improving. Counties that remained stable were the most disadvantaged. We did find some indication of general economic improvement, including amongst counties classified as stable or declining. Unemployment declined and income increased across all trajectory groups, though risers saw the largest gains. Two factors beyond level of disadvantage are particularly related to county trajectories: racial and ethnic demographics, and industry. counties with a larger Black population were the worst off pre and post-recession. Structural racism remains a defining characteristic of disadvantage, echoing findings you will hear from others in today's presentation and in the larger volume. And while there is no indicator of working class county, no standard one, and there are challenges in operationalizing that, we classify counties with less than the median proportion of working age adults holding a bachelor's degree as a working class county. By that definition, about 2/3 of working class counties are classified as disadvantaged. So as all counties did, these working class counties improved with respect to employment and income. However, as I mentioned, educational attainment was associated with rising through the recovery. And greater reliance on manufacturing was associated with declining or being stable through the period. So this suggests that working class counties, as we have defined, would have gained the least through the long recovery. To conclude, the portrait that emerges from this study is that classifying place-based disadvantage through just one indicator could be misleading. Depending on the measure used, geographies could appear to benefit from the long recovery, or they could have looked as if they were declining. Place-based interventions should therefore take a multidimensional approach as we continue to weather the socioeconomic storm from the COVID-19 pandemic. We should pay close attention to working class counties and those with large populations of Black residents.
Thank you. Thank you. And we get to ask you now, Jasmine or Jasmine?
It's Jasmine Simington.
Jasmine. Okay, great. Thank you, Jasmine. All right. So the next paper is by Professor Jeff Smith, who is the Paul Hayne Distinguished Chair in Economics and the Richard Meese Chair in Applied Econometrics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Department of Economics. And he's going to be talking about workforce entry, including career and technical education and the role that it played during this time. So Jeff, welcome and take it away.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Let me mention my two esteemed co-authors. Lois Miller is a doctoral student in the economics program here at Wisconsin. So she is a future 2 years away Wisconsin PhD. Bert Barno is an old friend of mine that I met in grad school working on the JTPA study project. He is a Wisconsin PhD from a very long time ago. So it was sort of fun to work with the two of them on this project, and I appreciate the editors giving us the opportunity. Next slide, please. We're going to focus on youth. One of the things that Tim didn't mention that we spent a bunch of time on at the beginning was sort of deciding who and what to focus on. And different papers had to do it a bit differently because of data limitations and things. So we're focusing on youth in the years shortly after high school. Exact age ranges bounce around a bit because of data sources, and we're going to sort of start in 2005 and go up to the pandemic. Next slide, please. A couple acronyms that'll be useful. The world of job training is rich in acronyms. So CTE is what we used to call vocational education. Now it's career and technical education. ALMP is a Europeanism. Stands for active labor market programs because they wanted to distinguish programs that had people do something from programs that involved just transfer of funds. In the US, these are often called employment and training programs. Next slide, please. So our chapter does a lot of things. It sort of provides a broad overview of trends in education and employment. It provides trends in post-secondary enrollment by sector. It reviews trends in active labor market program participation. And then it reviews developments in the CTE/ALMP evaluation literature, mostly but not entirely within economics. And finally, we had some remarks at the end about COVID and the related COVID recession. Next slide, please. So this gives the work and education status of 20 to 21-year-olds over the period that we cover, so 2005 to 2019. ALMP, again, is active labor market program. So that, as we will discuss in a few slides, that's going to, you can think of WIOA as the paradigmatic, the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act as the paradigmatic US active labor market program. Next slide, please. What do I want you to take away from that graph? The Great Recession was sort of a standard recession other than lasting a long time, as Tim pointed out. Something that I did not know, at least before we looked at these graphs, was that schooling remained persistently higher following the Great Recession. It didn't return all the way to pre-recession levels. And there's a gradual post-Great Recession decline in what Bert likes to call opportunity youth, what the Brits call NEETs, for not in employment, education, or training. That's probably a good thing. Next slide, please. This is education by institution type for 20 to 21-year-olds by year. What surprised us here, I guess, was two things. First of all, there's a sort of persistent increase in the fraction of people in four-year publics over this period. And that continues even during the sort of boom of the teens, which maybe the standard thinking would say it shouldn't. The other thing that surprised us a bit is that there's a gradual decline in two-year publics during that same period. I think the research literature has sort of discovered two-year colleges over that period in a way that it had not before. There's the whole higher ed literature, whole post-secondary literature has an issue that most of the people who write the papers are at one small set of institutions that are pretty different from all the rest. And I think partly because of that, some of the other sorts of institutions don't get studied as much as they should. There are other reasons for that too. Next slide. So this just says the things that I didn't, that I just said before. And I just will remind people that even though there's a lot of attention to the for-profit sector, and even though it accounts for a lot of issues in the student loan domain, in terms of the number of students, it's actually pretty small, even at the end of this period. Next slide, please. This kind of reprises what Tim told us about. So let me go through this pretty quickly and go on to the next slide with the highlights. Yeah, there we go. The recession, the Great Recession, is clear and persistent in the medians. It's pretty much the same if you look at means. The recovery shows meaningful improvement for everybody. As Tim mentioned, you can worry yourself about sort of means versus medians. You can worry about relative versus absolute changes, but there's certainly a lot to like in the absolute changes. I think on that we can all agree. Next slide, please. Let me now tell you about the two largest active labor market programs in the US. The first one is presently called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. It is the most recent in a long line of programs going back in the early part of our period. There is the Workforce Investment Act. Prior to that, there is the Job Training Partnership Act in the 80s and 90s. Prior to that, there is the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act in the 70s. And prior to that, there is the Manpower Demonstration and Training Act in the 60s, which was introduced because of fears of automation taking away our jobs. Anyway, back in the 21st century. So what does WIOA do? WIOA offers three sets of things: core services, which are sort of very job search oriented, what it called intensive services under WIA, and is now lumped into career services under WIOA, which is more involved things where you might take interest inventories or tests to determine sort of what your abilities are, and sit down and spend more time with a caseworker kind of plotting out strategy for immediate return to the labor market, or else for further investment in human capital that would be subsidized by the program. Many people who participate in WIA or WIOA do not get any training. Over the WIA period in particular, it was generally thought that you kind of wanted to get people back in the labor market if you could, and saved the training for the folks who had trouble with immediate return to the labor market. Most of the training here is provided under contract, often to community colleges, sometimes to nonprofits. There's a separate program for youth. There's a separate program for adults. There's a separate program for dislocated workers. We did not focus on the dislocated worker program because they don't really fit into our population of interest. They're mostly older people with strong labor market histories and reasonably high earnings. The program is distinguished by a lot of performance management. This is where sort of quantitative performance management started out in the US government, was in this sequence of programs. There are always concerns about cream skimming and so on, resulting from the structure and design of the performance management system. That's a little bit beyond our point today. The Job Corps dates back to the 60s. It is a residential program, sort of inspired by the Civilian Conservation Corps, going back to the 30s. It's a very intensive and expensive program that's designed to sort of remove people from their home neighborhoods and put them out oftentimes in a more rural environment, and to provide a combination of education, occupational training, and life skills training over a period of many months. It's very different in that sense from WIOA. Next slide, please. This picture shows kind of enrollment in these programs. The first thing I would highlight is that the numbers on the vertical scale are percents of the 18 to 21-year-old population, and those are decimals. So something like 0.1%, 0.2%, 0.1%, or 0.2%, depending on whether you count the people who stay long enough to have training, are in the Job Corps program. These are small programs. There's a big uptick in the WIOA program, actually the WIA program, in the Great Recession, because a lot of money was spent on it in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. But if you go to discussions of sort of active labor market programs or employment training programs that have an international focus, what you will hear everybody say is, wow, the US doesn't spend very much on these programs relative to other developed countries, such as Western European countries, even relative to Canada. We could talk about whether we have it right or all those other countries have it right, but if they voted, they would have it right. Next slide, please. So Job Corps has actually been getting smaller. The youth part of WIOA is pretty small. Does that mean we're really not doing anything? This is kind of a separate point. We have these discussions, these international discussions sometimes that I'm a part of. Something that Bert Barno and I say in our chapter in the means tested transfer book that was published by NBER a few years ago is that really the biggest active labor market program in a sense in the US is Pell Grants. Now, a big chunk of Pell Grants, most Pell Grants go to four-year schools. We did a thing in the chapter where we sort of tried to figure out which majors in two-year institutions and four-year institutions are vocational or occupational. And we concluded that almost all of the ones in two-year institutions are occupational. And even a lot of the ones in four-year institutions are occupational. Now, some of that stuff is engineering, which is kind of not the population we have here, but some of that is things like criminal justice at directional schools. And that is kind of relevant to the population here. So the last line notes Pell Grants pay for more training than we and Job Corps combined. That's kind of easily, that is true. And one of the things that we offer up in the chapter is that it would be nice if discussions of sort of workforce issues were more integrated with discussions of kind of post-secondary, especially two-year post-secondary issues. Now, there's a long history here that the literatures are siloed and the data are siloed, that it's, in most states, the WIOA data is over here and the community college data is over here, and there's no way to combine them or look at them together, even though it would be very useful for these purposes. And again, ALMP is active labor market programs. Next slide, please. What has the literature been up to? There was an experimental evaluation of the Job Corps that sort of happened just before the period we cover. It actually produced findings that were very similar to the non-experimental evaluation of the Job Corps 20 years earlier by the same firm. Job Corps, which is kind of unique among programs for youth, yes, I can finish in 2 minutes, actually has positive impacts on youth. They're not quite large enough for most of the groups it serves to pass a cost benefit test, but a lot of programs for youth don't even manage the positive net impact part. So that's why 2 cheers for the Job Corps. There was an experimental evaluation of the Workforce Investment Act called the Gold Standard Evaluation. It illustrated that in the US institutional environment, you can do an experiment, and I like experiments. I like, exogenous variation that I know is exogenous because I made it exogenous. At the same time, the way the experiment was set up, and I had some minor hand in that, resulted in impacts that are difficult to interpret. And so there's some debate about what it means out there. I would say it means that the marginal training that we have paid for has a low payoff. I don't think it shows that the infra-marginal training necessarily has a low payoff, but that's something we can talk about in Q&A. There's been a lot of enthusiasm for these sort of sectoral training programs. Some of them have very impressive evaluation results. What is unclear is the extent to which they can be scaled up to broader, less selected populations, and the extent to which there is enough demand for the things that they train people for to scale them up in a big way. Finally, there's been a bunch of academic papers using state administrative data on community colleges showing that it's good for earnings to finish credentials in fields of demand. We might have known that from theory, but we have a lot more solid evidence of it now. Next slide, which is also the last slide. The damn pandemic. This is a funny recession because it doesn't result from underlying structural issues like most previous recessions have. We've all paid a lot of fixed costs. Here we are on Zoom. We know how to do this now. That's going to have long-term effects on things. They're truly, to somebody who sits where I sit, interesting thing about this recession was that it did not result in an increase in enrollment in institutions of higher education. Usually the opportunity cost goes down, people are not working, so they go get more schooling. That did not happen this time for reasons I think are probably obvious to everybody. The other thing we talk about a little bit in the chapter is that maybe working at home was less important for our group because of their industry mix than for other groups in the population. So next slide, please. That's just the reference. Thanks for your attention. I hope you'll have the opportunity to consider our chapter in detail. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Okay, and the last paper that we're going to discuss is going to be presented by 2 of the authors. Professor Fenaba Addo is an associate professor of public policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her recent work is on debt and wealth inequality with a focus on family relationships and higher education. And she's joined by her co-author, William Sandy Darity, Jr., is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equality at Duke University. And they are going to be talking about racial wealth differences over the period that we've been looking at. So Sandy and Fenaba, please take it away.
Please lead.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Thanks for that introduction. So I'm going to start and then Sandy will follow. I'm going to provide a brief overview of our paper and some of the key results that we found. As Erica said, we were asked or tasked with looking at racial wealth inequality with a specific focus on the working class and in this period of recovery from the Great Recession, which lasted from 2007 to 2009. One of the things that was important as we set up our paper was being sure we were clear about how we defined the working class. And so we had 2 key criteria, first being the labor force attachment, so how the people within our sample, which I'm going to explain in a second, were attached to the labor force, and the relationship to the means of production. So we're going to make this distinction by creating 2 groups, the working class and the professional class. And so to provide a little bit more information about the sample or how we created it, we Our data were drawn from the Survey of Consumer Finances. We used, in the paper, we used the 4 survey waves post-Great Recession, so 2010, 2013, 2016, and 2019. The results I'll be presenting today are just going to show the 2010 and 2019 results, just for succinctness. And then we are going to focus on racial categories outlined in the survey, so non-Latinx Black, Latinx, and non-Latinx white households, with a specific focus on the respondents who were between the ages of 25 and 64, who were not retired or disabled or out of the labor force. As many may be aware or maybe not aware, one of the reasons why we tend to rely on the Survey of Consumer Finances, because it really is considered like the gold standard for collecting information on household net worth. So this includes total accounting of all total financial and non-financial assets, as well as total liabilities or debts. So we say net worth, it's the difference between one's total assets minus their net worth. And they really do a great job of asking and trying to glean information on the net worth or the wealth of households within the sample. And so our criteria for kind of outlining who was working class, we include in our sample individuals who also report themselves as being self-employed. And in particular, to classify or to qualify as working class, the individual had to indicate that they were employed by someone else and did not hold a managerial or professional occupation. So I'm going to get to some of the results that we see. One of the things, as we highlight right in the in the title of the paper, is this idea of disparate recoveries, right? So as the economy rebounded after the official end of the recession, we see labor force participation increasing across all of the racial racial and ethnic categories that we explore, but the participation lagging among for Black workers under our classification. So even by 2019, we still see they have lower rates than both non-Latinx white and Latinx prior to at the very start of the post-recovery or the recovery period. We also find that when we look at the 2 groups that we analyze, or the working class versus the professional class by racial and ethnic categories, that for Black and Latinx, the working class make up a majority of the labor force participants within their racial groups. If we look especially at the Latinx categories, they make up over 3/4 of the labor force participants. So this slide here really highlights some of our main and key findings from our paper. I'm just going to spend some time here, where we show that the median net worth increased for all groups between 2010 and 2019. However, as we say in our abstract and highlight consistently throughout the paper, that the median net worth of all Black households remained lower. So for both Black working class and professional class households was lower than the white working class households within the sample. And this relationship remained consistent across the entire post-recovery period. Another finding that I think is important is that within the white racial category, we see that working class households in relative terms, in percentage terms, actually rebounded quite a bit, even though they did have, they started from a much lower threshold. That's all I'm gonna focus on there. And then, I'm just gonna summarize so that Sandy can have some time. So as we highlight in the paper, and there's so much, this paper, we really pack in quite a lot of analyses and interesting findings, but we see that fewer Black working class households benefited from the economic recovery in terms of their net worth relative to the white working class in both absolute and relative terms. As I just highlighted, within white households, the working class experienced the greatest increase in both absolute and relative terms. And as we think about what this means as we entered into the COVID period, many Black households entered into the pandemic in a very real state of financial precarity, just not having enough or relatively lower levels of wealth to weather the health and labor market shocks that happened in early 2020. So yeah, thanks. Pass over to you, Sandy, now.
Thank you, Fenaba. I'd like to highlight what I think is one of the central findings in our work, which is the fact that the wealth position of Blacks who are in the professional managerial class lags far behind the wealth position of whites who are in the working class. We thought at one point that this would be in contrast with income, where we anticipated that the income of the professional managerial class members who were Black would be higher than the income of working class whites. But in fact, we didn't find that to be the case. What is true is that the disparity in wealth is far greater between these two social class groups across racial lines than the disparity in income. And so one of the things that that we managed to discern overnight was the fact that between 2013 and 2019, there was a change in the ratio of professional class Black income to working class white income from approximately 84 cents to the dollar to 87 cents to the dollar. So those numbers border on 90 cents to the dollar roughly. But in contrast, with respect to wealth, in 2010, Black professionals had 44 cents to the dollar of net worth that was held by members of the white working class. By the time we get to 2016, that proportion had dropped to 15 cents per dollar, and by 2019 had only recovered slightly to 17 cents per dollar. So there's an enormous disparity between the degree of wealth inequality across class and racial lines. There's a tremendous disparity that's much greater than the disparity between income inequality. And this corresponds to other ways of thinking about class status. If we were to look at educational attainment as an alternative measure of social class position, we'll find that Black heads of household with a college degree only have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of household who never finished high school. A last way in which we might consider classifying individuals by social class status is to think about income differences. And here we find the same kind of paradox, where Blacks with higher levels of income than whites across the board tend to have much lower levels of wealth. But one of the more striking examples of this is that the median wealth for the poorest white households, the bottom 20% of the income distribution, is larger than the median wealth for all Black households taken collectively. In the SCF, it's the difference between $26,340 for whites who are in the lowest end of the income distribution versus a median of $24,800 for all Blacks in the United States. And the poorest Blacks in the United States, those in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, have a median net worth that is less than $1,900, in contrast with the $26,000 figure for median white households in the bottom end of the distribution. So the reason I wanted to point this out and emphasize this is because there has been a growing tendency among some of the economists at the Federal Reserve Board to argue that if we could close income differences, we could correspondingly close the wealth gap in the United States. And I want to propose that the evidence that we've advanced in our paper suggests that that is not the case, that something far more dramatic has to be done to address wealth differentials in the United States across racial lines. And as many of you know, I'm actually an advocate of a reparations plan for Black American descendants of US slavery.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Fenaba and Sandy. So I want to start our discussion by, and I invite, and certainly I invite the rest of the discussants to join me for this, is by noting that when we think about these broader issues of creating social equity, and we think back to the New Deal and the Great Society, there have always been two goals that we've had here. One is to provide relief, a safety net that puts a floor on the deprivations of abject poverty. And then the other goal has always been to provide a pathway to the middle class, to prosperity for anybody in those situations. And these are two goals, and at times they even seem to be in conflict with each other. In the past 40 years, we have seen that the safety net that we provided does not seem to open up much of a pathway towards shared prosperity. So whatever progress we've made about providing this floor for subsistence, this relief, has kept people fed and clothed, but has failed to provide upward mobility for many of them. And these three papers represent three different approaches, come to that same conclusion about the widening rifts in our social fabric, particularly along racial and educational lines. And Jeff in particular has called attention to findings that don't bode well for a post-COVID future either. So when we think about what kinds, think in terms of policy for improving mobility, there are two general strands of approaches. One is raising the incentives for people to strive to reach middle class or upper middle class existence through work primarily, and but also through home ownership, things like that. And the second is opening up more avenues to the middle class for people. So one focuses on the incentives to make the jump, and the other says, well, let's widen the pathway, right? So incentives and avenues. Putting it another way, these policies can also focus on reducing relief, which increases incentives, or reducing barriers to transitions. And the policies and outcomes we've seen over the last 40 years have certainly increased incentives by raising inequality. So we know the incentives are higher than they ever used to be, right? But we don't see that those increased incentives have increased mobility. So, instead of those widening inequality, increasing mobility, what we've seen is a decline in mobility. And that suggests policies that focus on increasing avenues for more mobility. And these are the kinds of things, so the discussion now might think about those. And in our paper, Harry and I suggest some ideas, but there are obviously more ideas beyond this. And these can be strengthening our public education system, because that's accessible to people from all walks of life. So particularly community colleges and our workforce development systems to improve workers' ability to adapt to labor market shocks and to prepare them in general for training. We can also strengthen the institutions that support workers on the job promote job security, training, and compensation for workers without college degrees, and that's supporting collective bargaining, minimum wages in particular, and other avenues for workers and worker voice. A third possibility are the place-based policies, as Jasmine was talking about, being important. Place-based policies to improve job creation in the places where underserved people live. The fourth possibility is more rewards for high road or high wage employers who invest in their workers and share profits with them. There are also additional ways to make work pay for lower wage workers, such as the earned income tax credit, better family leave, and subsidized high quality childcare. A sixth route is policies to enhance competition in product and labor markets that would limit employer restrictions on worker options and information, reducing monopsony, worker power, and killer. The last two I'll mention would be special efforts to reduce barriers among workers who have health or disabilities or criminal records, so focusing on particularly disadvantaged groups. And then finally, this is important to me, it doesn't always make the list of active labor market policies, but I would say that this underpins so many of these efforts, improving our official labor market statistics so that we can know how well things work and don't work, and provide the information to make the best policy decisions. And along with that, collecting the data that we need to actually evaluate programs and their effectiveness. So with that introduction, that this seems to be a time where we want to focus on increasing avenues to the middle class. I invite more Q&A from the audience and my discussants, my fellow panel members to jump in.
Thank you so much, Erica. So as a first question, and I want to start with Fenaba and Sandy on this one, but I'd like to reach all panelists, so we've got this large domestic spending package sort of currently under negotiation. How do you think that the potential outcomes we might see with that could affect the outcomes that you're looking at in your analyses there? If you want to take that on.
Okay, I'll start. Fenaba's got mute on. So I'd actually like to connect that with Erica's observations, because I think the distinction that I'd like to make is between policies that supplement incomes and policies that build assets or wealth. And I think that since the 1960s, much of American social policy has focused almost exclusively on income supplements and has not focused on asset building. The only exception might be the tax system, which actually promotes greater levels of wealth for the folks who are already wealthy, but we don't have a program of asset building that's comparable to what was pursued in the late 19th century or in most of the 20th century. So in the late 19th century, asset building focused on the provision of land under policies like the Homestead Act of 1862. And so instead of thinking about raising incentives, what the nation actually did was give 1.5 million white families a literal handout of property that was the foundation for their wealth accumulation. And today it's estimated that 45 million living white Americans are descendants in families that have been beneficiaries of the Homestead Act land patents. In the 20th century, federal policy shifts to asset building that's based upon or predicated on home ownership. And this is executed in a discriminatory fashion, just as the land allocation policy was executed in a discriminatory fashion. Whether we're thinking about the Federal Housing Administration's interaction with local banks for the purposes of establishing a system of redlining, or if we're thinking about the uneven and unequal distribution or allocation of home buying subsidies and mortgages under the GI Bill. So I think that the real question is whether or not the nation moves away from an emphasis exclusively on income supplements towards a restoration of asset building initiatives. And if it does so in such a way that it compensates Black Americans for the denial of those asset building opportunities in the past. But I certainly don't think that education or support for workers or any of those strategies will have much of an effect on the racial wealth gap. Because its origins and sources are not linked primarily to programs that can address or increase people's incomes.
Fenaba, did you have more you wanted to add there?
Okay. I'll let Tim go since we're short on time. Tim,
Okay.
I just wanted to say that I agree with Sandy, but there's a lot of, first of all, one thing is if we get this infrastructure plan through and we start, that will help both poor areas and it will lead to way more demand for working class jobs, construction jobs and so forth. This is, if we get that through, that'll be good. The other thing is the surprising effects of the child tax credit now, the refundable child tax credit. Only half of the poor are actually getting it. The people who are getting it right now are the working class. They've had a very big increase in their incomes. And if you look at what they're doing with it, they have emergency savings now. They're buying down debts, they have emergency savings. Every 529 plan I've seen is advertising to people to take their money from their child tax credits and put it into college savings plans. And a lot of that is actually going on right now. So it's indirect, I understand, Sandy. And I must say that—
Well, no, but Tim, I don't think that the infrastructure plan is a bad idea at all. I'm just saying that these policies, which are essentially in some sense universal for all Americans, will do very little to eliminate racial wealth differences.
I agree. And in particular, in fact, in Jim Ziliak, looking at material well-being, in his chapter, he pointed out that one of the poorest findings was that for the working class, who we defined as people as non-college educated between once and twice the poverty line, was the fact that Black home ownership fell during the Great Recession and stayed low all the way through. So many people are in the middle class, they're and working class, their major assets are home, and not enough African Americans own homes. So a deliberate policy that would build that, I think, would be helpful.
Okay. Yeah, so I want to turn, Jasmine, I'd love to hear from you on this. This is kind of going to be our last question here. We're essentially out of time, but I want to make sure we hear from each of the presenters before we go. I mean, Jasmine, what do you see in your work there?
Yeah, I think, so our paper is focused on place-based policy. And so a lot of the talk around the spending bill is really trying to get at, I think, moving the needle on individuals and hoping that it will sort of aggregate to community level change. But I think seeing greater emphasis on those place-based policies, again, thinking about the multi-dimensional impacts of recovery. Would love to see a little bit more of that.
Okay. And Jeff? Oh, you're muted, I think.
There we go. My takeaway from today will be that analogy to the 19th century land giveaways. That's really interesting, but that's not really what you're asking about. You know, I don't have a policy in my hand to tell you how we do this, but another way that people accumulate assets is by running businesses. And I would have liked to have heard some chit chat about that in the course of this discussion. You know, I think even though I am a producer of human capital, I think that sometimes the professor class overemphasizes the pathway that we took in a profession relative to the pathway of trying to start a business and provide a product or service that people are excited to pay for. And that's a path to wealth accumulation. I don't think we know very well how to promote business formation among particular groups, but it would be something we should try to learn.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'd like to end with Erica today, but Fenaba, I want to give you a chance to kind of chime in here before we go, because I know you've got more to add here, and we've got a minute or two for that.
Just off of what Jeff just said, I agree, but we know that there are racial disparities in access to capital with regards to entrepreneurship and self-employment. So, I think we still need to think of policy solutions to address that avenue as well. I absolutely agree with regard to the human capital pathway and thinking of alternative ways to wealth building, in particular with regards to business. But as an inequality scholar, I can't help but not address that there are disparate ways to access to capital that prevent people from benefiting in that particular pathway.
Okay,
Yeah.
Erica, how do we bring this all together?
Wow. Well, one thing I would say is Fenaba took the words out of my mouth, that access to capital is clearly an important part of gaining some of the benefits of growth and productivity. But the other one is noting that up until the mid-1970s, productivity and workers' real earnings, the compensation share of output grew together, right? So that when workers became more productive, they earned more. And then starting in the late 1970s, the wedge began growing larger and larger, so that more of the returns to capital are going to the owners of capital and fewer of them are going to workers these days. And that's an important part of wealth accumulation as well, getting the workers being able to get some returns to the rising productivity that they contribute to. So I think the takeaway here is that fundamentally we're all pretty much agreeing that while we may have had as a society a success in providing providing relief to the poorest of our fellow citizens, that we have a lot to learn on how to provide equal avenues for success for everybody. And some of it depends on the wealth that they have underpinning them, and some of it depends on the opportunities despite wealth to advance. And if we want to do this right, we're going to need, as I said before, a lot of data, a lot of experimentation. Neither of those alone will do it, but the willingness to experiment, the willingness to honestly evaluate the results, I think, key going forward. And I hope that the involvement of researchers like this and the people who are in on this conference will help to make that a reality.
Okay. Erica, Tim, Sandy, Jasmine, Fenaba, and Jeff, thank you all so much for taking the time to do this. We covered a lot of ground. So as a note, I will be sending out the recording hopefully later on today, and I'll provide that link that Tim talked about earlier to the volume that we were camped out on today. And I just want to note that we do have two more webinars coming up in the next 3 weeks that folks can join us for. This coming Thursday, we're going to be hearing on issues related to fatherhood in the COVID-19 pandemic. And then on November 17th, we're going to be looking at more on COVID, but kind of the impact of COVID on people who resided in correctional institutions, kind of how some of that has played out and areas we can focus there. So you can look for emails for those two. And again, thanks to all of our presenters and everyone that joined us today. Bye now.